This is a really important phone call. Make sure that nobody's listening, okay? Yes, Mom, I did my laundry, okay? Yeah, okay. Alright, bye. Surveillance is everywhere these days. You can't even have a normal conversation without the chance of somebody listening in. I don't know about you guys, but that makes me feel a little bit uncomfortable. My group is going to be talking about big data, surveillance, and computational politics. Basically, following the reading by Zeynep Tufecki. Basically, following the reading by Zeynep Tufecki. I'm with Vedant, Nathan, and Zakwan. And I'm sure many of you have already read the reading, but in case you haven't, I'm going to more or less go over the main topics covered by the reading itself. So basically, it is explained that the internet allows for expansive communication opportunities, which is pretty obvious for many of us. Social media, it's super easy to talk to people and make these relationships with people on the other side of the world. But with all this increased communication opportunities, there's also a little bit of a downside that is not, there's not too much light shed upon that side. Obviously, many of us are aware that people could be watching us through our phones, but most of us don't give it too much of a thought. But let me just explain on what exactly, what exact information they could be getting for you. First of all, as a whole, we have kind of moved away from demographics to more individualized targeting. Back even like 100 years ago, most of the advertisements that were given to people were given through television, and sometimes it's hard to predict exactly whether or not maybe the person watching the TV may be interested in what you have to say. So, but now we can kind of target people individually to see kind of like what you're into and give you some advertisements and things that are targeted more towards you, where you're more likely to interact with these posts or advertisements, quote unquote. A few keywords to note that were very prominent in the reading was big data and information asymmetry. So basically, big data they're large data sets that are analyzed to show trends, patterns, and associations that are relating to human behavior and interactions, right? So they basically make these trends of data that they get from people like you, not necessarily always with your direct consent, and but we're gonna get to the engineering of consent in a minute. And they start making trends out of it, and this is all information that can be used by large organizations, right? And the interesting thing about information asymmetry is that the people who are holding the data know about individuals, while the individuals don't know what these practitioners know about them, right? So yes, you know that somebody may be watching you, but you don't know exactly what information they have and what information they don't have. Usually it's safe to say that they had a lot of information that they don't directly share with you. This kind of brings about a very interesting other keyword that I did not really see in the reading, but I think it's very important and essential to the narration of this article, and that's called your digital footprint, right? So what is a digital footprint? Basically, it is the information about a particular person that exists on the internet as a result of their activity online, right? Every time you do something, every time you like a post, every time you post a picture, every time you click on a YouTube video, you have a digital footprint, right? For example, you can see your history on pretty much any social media website, any website, just even on Google itself. It gives you your search history. You could delete it, but it's not really gone. Your digital footprint is there, right? And given that usually we're using a search engine such as Google or something, they kind of hold on to that information. You may get rid of it, but they hold on to it because they use that information and compare it to other trends about you, and they can really pull some crazy information out of you. And just to put this into perspective, the FBI, for example, doesn't even need a warrant to surveil you, and these big companies, like I said, such as Google, Facebook, Amazon, Apple, they're all watching you to a certain extent. But most of these big companies, seem to be using the data for marketing and progression politics, which is computational politics. We're going to get to that in a minute as well. But before I get into that, I do want to mention again the engineering of consent. Now, what is engineering of consent? Well, the way I like to put this into perspective, I guess you could say, is do you know when you are downloading a video or a software or a game, and then there's that giant like paragraph. You know what I mean? That basically you never read, but you always hit allow or accept. And why is that? They do that on purpose strategically because they know that you're most likely not going to spend the next half an hour going through every line, making sure that everything is sound and very morally sound. So you usually just hit accept, and in that way they're engineering consent in you because you may not be aware that you've given them consent, but you've given them consent for a lot of things that they can do with your information that they will take fully advantage of, right? And sometimes you can catch on to this when you see that you're giving them some permissions that don't really seem to correlate whatsoever with the program or software that you are installing. So you just got to be very careful for that. Things like cookies, for example. You know, these websites keep tabs on your information so they can find you again. And some of us might say that's a pro because we'll be targeted things that we want to see. But that's also a con because your information, your personal information, is going to be out there for grabs for anybody. I don't think that's something that many people feel very comfortable with. The reading brings up 6 very interesting points. So big data impacts the public sphere using computational politics, primarily through 6 dynamics that pertain to computational politics. I'm going to get to that in 1 second. But what are computational politics, right? It's basically the focus of the paper in the sense that it's basically applying some computational methods to a very large data set from online and offline sources, from conducting outreach, persuasion, and mobilization in services, right? A few examples. Electing for a candidate, a policy or even a legislation, right? This is when we start getting a little bit more political here, right? This kind of brings about a very interesting conversation that we may remember from quite a bit ago when we're talking about do artifacts have politics. We're talking more about computational artifacts here, and the answer for the most part is yes. If you can argue that something as insignificant as a pencil have some sort of political value into it, it is very, very easy to make several arguments explaining why computers have their own computational politics involved, and that's part of the reason, part of the arguments made in the article, right? If your computer senses that you are more interested in one candidate than another one, that particular candidate can have more ads targeted towards you that are going to or incentivize you to go and decide to vote for them. Because yes, this is more democratic in the sense that we can choose who we want as our next leader, but in a very it is very superficial in the sense that you mainly vote for the main 2 people you hear about, right? There were many other candidates running, but a lot of them you didn't even really hear about because their ads were not placed in front of your eyes, right? So you ended up seeing only a handful, when in reality there could have been a few more that maybe you even would have liked more. These computers are very political. So that brings us to the 6 dynamics that I was talking about of computational politics. So number 1, increasing available data to large organizations, right? We mentioned that earlier. Your data can be readily available to all these large organizations who can use your information to target you specifically. Number 2, political targeting. I also mentioned this one very briefly as well. They can use your information to target you specific political advertisements because they want to get your vote, right? And even if you're maybe not even interested, they can they'll be able to see that in your trends and graphs, and they might even feed you more and more. So subconsciously, you're like, oh hey, maybe I should go vote for this. It seems kind of interesting. Now that I've seen this the 15th time, maybe it's something I should be looking at. Number 3, this one is this is a big one. Getting answers from people without asking questions. Now, I know we've all encountered like those maybe YouTube surveys where they ask you a question, you always hit skip. These large-scale organizations that are usually tethered to the confines of technology have the ability to ask you questions or get answers to questions without having to ask you directly. And this follows very closely with the sixth point, which I'm going to get to also in a minute. But they can ask you questions they can answer questions about you without having to ask you anything, right? Now, this is very dangerous in the sense that people can answer questions about you when some of that information, the answers to those questions may be pretty private, such as maybe like a medical condition or something that you don't want open for everybody to know, right? And then maybe what Google catches on to that you have this particular illness, and then they'll start giving you all these advertisements on that, but not in your best interest. And it's what most benefits them financially. They're going to target you. This has many levels to it. Talking a little bit about how like power and money can be correlated in some social systems. That is true for a lot of the United States. Money is power. So at the end of the day, most of the large-scale organizations are after your money, so they're going to target you things that are going to benefit them the best. We have enhanced network-based social engineering. That brings us to behavioral science, right? The article mentions enhanced network-based social engineering. In the sense of behavioral science, right, that we're talking about human behavioral, they can make predictive graphs based on the vast amount of information that they already have from you in order to predict trends in the future trends about you, right? If you, for example, you're looking up, you need a lot of calculus help every day. At 2 p.m. you've been looking at all these calc videos. Then you might start noticing that on YouTube you're getting some like Sal from Khan Academy ads. Not saying all this is a bad thing, but it can get to the point where they're getting into some dangerous territories that you don't want to be public. Number 5, we're talking about experimental in real-time environments. Now, what is that? Basically, it's like real-time testing with like immediate results and immediate deployment of ads accordingly to those results. I think that one, for the most part, is very self-explanatory. If they have a question about you, back to maybe the third point, if they have a question about you, they'll deploy some ads on you as soon as they see you're online. Be like, hey, maybe we shouldn't promote this because they skip the ad as soon as they get the chance. Let's try something else, and then just rinse and repeat until you get something where you're which is a little more eye-catching and that takes your attention more, and then that's when they got you. All right, number 6, power platforms and algorithmic governance. Right now, these companies are getting so much information from you to the point that it is very difficult to manage all that information and know what to do with all of it. Now, it's all run by an algorithm supervised by people, but that manages all this information with regards to content visibility, data sharing, and many other features of political consequence. It's already been found that even to the slight alteration of some rankings on Google, what is on the first page of Google, can impact an election, which is huge. Because when you have a platform that everybody's going on, it would be best to keep the platform in and of itself somewhat neutral to a specific extent to allow for the full magnitude of democracy to take place. If you're constantly being fed biased results, you might start going to that side. You know what I mean? If you feel pressured to do something, social pressure is a very real thing. If you see everybody else doing something, you might start doing that. And when we're talking about a political sense here, you don't necessarily want everybody to just be following the trends that everybody else is doing. You want people to have their own independent thoughts. So even something as simple, even something as big as an election, can in and of itself be unbiased. With that said, I would like to kind of start closing out with a few questions here. First of all, before we get into the deeper questions, just ballpark, does anybody know how old Google is off the top of your head? How old do you think Google is, right? We have something that's basically running our lives day to day, where we seem to use without even a second thought. And yet, this isn't actually that old. How old do you guys think that Google is? Well, Google is actually only 22 years old. So it's very interesting to see how exponentially this surveillance has seemed to become an issue, right? You cannot go anywhere without having the chance of somebody watching you, right? For example, every time there's an accident, every time something happens on the news, you usually see some sort of picture or video from the incident. The reason why is because we have all these buildings with security cameras. You have people's cameras with people's phones with cameras that can be tapped. There's just so much information out there about you that you're not even aware of. And that brings us to tracing, right? Has anyone here ever used the Everbridge app at RPI? When I first got here, I was under the impression that I needed to have this app installed for more or less contact tracing. How do you think this impacted your life? Personally, it didn't impact me in too much of a crazy way, but after a while, I realized my roommate didn't have it, so I installed it because I felt a little uncomfortable with this such blatant contact tracing. Do you mind that you are constantly being watched? Does that disturb you in any sort of way? Do we really have privacy anymore? Is privacy something that has kind of become more and more unclear to the point where it may not necessarily exist anymore? Kind of going off these apps and such like that, it kind of brings a very interesting piece of technology that I thought was very relevant. I believe they're called these RFID tags that you get implanted, right? If many of you, I'm sure many of you have heard of them, some sort of way, shape, or form. So basically, these little chips that are put into you that you have surgically implanted to give you, let's say, access to some certain specific buildings, and maybe you can make a payment through them or something like that. They usually have a very basic computational purpose, but there are many issues with these implants. For example, do you really want that to be our future? Do you want for example, location? These chips, many of these chips can track your location, right? You have your phone off, you're not near your phone, but you're always being tracked, right? Even worse, it's literally a tracker on you. Now, this may be a little bit of a stretch for now, but think about the future. Imagine being targeted by large organizations when you're not even on your phone, when you're not even on your computer, when you're not even home. Imagine being specifically targeted. How would they know? Location, right? Embedded microphones. You need to make sure that whatever you're getting in you is as safe as possible and doesn't have, say, a microphone. How awful will that be if somebody could constantly listen to what you were saying no matter where you were, especially if you become a person of power, a person of interest. And on top of that, these RFID tags do not have any, usually don't have any security measures embedded within them. So many of them are prone to being hacked. And then there you go, now all your information goes from this massive source to another source, which you don't know what either of them could be. On that note, I'd like to close it out and give the rest of it to my fellow presenters, and have a nice rest of your day.